I'm going to talk about our systematic study of amplification vulnerabilities in DNS. This is a joint work with Marco, Jodok, David, Adrian, and Bernhard. DNS is frequently associated with denial of service attacks, right? The most common kind of attack is reflection, which exploits DNS requests with spoofed victim IP address. Reflection attacks usually come together with amplifications, in the sense that DNS responses can be much larger than requests. This is a simple form of amplification due to asymmetric message size, and there's no big difference between the number of messages from the attacker and the number of messages to the victim. So the message amplification factor is just 1. Another type of attack is pseudo-random subdomain, and the idea is to send a request that bypass the cache of a recursive resolver, and the result in non-existing domain responses. And depending on the setup, the attack can target a recursive or an authoritative server, but it comes with no amplification in either case. So apart from these common attacks, we have seen the emergence of a new class of application layer amplification attacks, where a single client request can trigger potentially many resolver queries towards name servers that host specially crafted records. So compared with pseudo-random subdomain, these attacks require a much lower request read by the attacker. And also they can generate queries that look more legitimate, right? For example, those with no answers. Furthermore, these attacks come in a large variety of forms, as I'm going to show in the rest of the presentation. So these facts make such attacks generally much more challenging to detect and mitigate than previous attacks. So as a motivation, I will briefly introduce 3 major variants discovered before our study. The first one, IDNS attack, makes use of NS records that indicate zone delegation. It basically exploits a cascade of NS records that cause the resolver to recursively look up dummy name servers in sequence. And a later attack, Unchained, applies a similar idea, but using a different type of record, CNAME, that maps that alias to a canonical name. So the main trick here is to split a CNAME chain between 2 name servers, such that it is not packed into a single response, and the resolver will look up each name on the chain. The last variant is NX-NS attack, which exploits a resolver's aggressive fetching of name servers. So whenever a resolver receives a large set of GULess NS records, it may proactively fetch multiple name servers for performance reasons, but this would generate excessive queries, right? So these attacks have demonstrated the feasibility of application layer amplification. But given that different DNS features can interact in a really complex way, how can we systematically discover more such vulnerabilities, right? And what is the maximum achievable amplification factor? So to answer these questions, we developed a taxonomy of what we call amplification primitives that are inherent to the design of DNS. So based on that, we analyzed methodologically how these primitives can be combined, and this gives birth to CAMP, a large family of vulnerabilities that can produce multiplicative amplification effects. So CAMP attacks can be launched against different types of servers. So first off, it can target a name server where the attacker can set up DNS zones. And of course, you could see that this attack makes sense only if the server doesn't belong to the attacker itself, right? So this is indeed the case for public hosting services, which I believe has been very well explained by Huayi in the previous talk. So here in our case, attacking a shared server there may affect many domains that are co-located with the attacker's domain. So a resolver can also be targeted, and the attacker would use multiple name servers to overload the victim resolver. And the attack will mostly affect cache missing requests from normal clients because they have to compete with the flood of resolver queries triggered by CAMP. So very interesting, we can even target an arbitrary server that is not accessible to attackers. The idea is to make certain ANS records point to the victim such that it will receive most queries from the amplifiers. A similar technique has been explored before, but CAMP opens up a whole range of possibilities for this attack scenario. So next, I will introduce our taxonomy of amplification primitives. The first question we ask is, what are the atomic forms of amplification? Right? During an amplified resolution process, a resolver will send a set of queries. We call the initial query name as a base and the subsequent names as derivatives. So we basically look at how these names relate to each other. To start with, we consider whether the names subsume each other. So on one extreme, all of them are on the same parts of the hierarchy, right? Which means they must be resolved in sequence and actually in a strict top-down manner. And then the names can also be identical and repeatedly queried. So we call this form of amplification self-probing. On the other extreme, all the names are on different parses and they are not suffixes of each other. So we further distinguish two cases here. First, all the derivatives are independently queryable and they can be resolved in parallel. We call this form fan-out, which extends the breadth of a resolution. Next, every derivative depends uniquely on another, and they must be looked up in order. And compared to fan-out, this chaining form extends the depth of a resolution. So what's nice now about this classification is that we can break down any complex resolution process into the three atomic forms, right? But before that, we must know how each of them is realized. There are two possible ways to realize self-probing. The first one, query name minimization, is a privacy-enhancing mechanism with known amplification effect. The other one, what we call dense delegation, exploits the innate delegation and the iterative resolution mechanism of DNS. And we find it for the first time. For fan-out, we generalize the technique used by NX attack and make it effective even for resolvers that have been patched. So for chaining, we also identified two primitives, refer chain and rewrite chain, with multiple variants that go beyond what have been reported by the previous attacks. So in total, we end up with 5 distinct primitives. And now let's look at how they can be combined. The key idea here is that one primitive's derivative can initiate another primitive, right? So we call the former primary and the latter secondary. So we focus on compositions that are regular and multiplicative, meaning that all the derivatives of the primary will initiate secondaries of the same size and type. It's also possible to have additive or irregular compositions, but they are easy to build once we have figured out the composability between primitives. So out of the 25 possible ways to combine the 5 primitives, we define 60 meaningful compositions, as summarized here. So all these constructible compositions are based on legitimate DNS features, except one that violates the RFC, requiring that an NS name or a name service name must not be an alias. But actually, we find many real-world resolvers are not compliant with this rule, and so they still allow this composition. A composition can be constructed statically or dynamically. So here's an example of a static construction with pre-installed zone files on 2 servers. So it's for a composition of rewrite chain composed with the fan-out, where you can see each name on the chain installed on the first server initiates a fan-out primitive installed on the second server, right? So for dynamic construction, we can use a customized name server to generate answers on the fly to the queries according to a predefined pattern without actually hosting any zone files. And this would allow us to bypass some protocol level constraints of standard DNS implementations. Now, what else can we do with the composability analysis? Well, we can go beyond 2 dimensions, right? So here's an example of 3D regular compositions where each derivative of the secondary chain initiates a tertiary self-probing primitive, right? By constructing such multidimensional compositions, potential irregular compositions, we can explore the amplification potential of a resolver until we reach its limit. So we have validated CAM on 3 major resolver implementations in a local controlled testbed. And this table here summarized their message amplification factor for different compositions, which are configured according to the resolver's default query limits, as shown in this bottom right table. So there are a couple of things I'd like to highlight from the results. So first, CAM can bypass a resolver's limits on individual DNS features, such as the length of the chain they follow or the number of name servers they fetch. And those limits cannot prevent resolvers from sending excessive queries, as you can see here. And second, most resolvers try to set a global query quota per client request, like 100 for bind and 32 for unbound. But this mechanism can be bypassed if it's not implemented properly. As you can see, this actually happens in many cases in our evaluation. So last but not the least, as the composition's dimensions increase, the multiplicative effect of CAM can become exponential. So with 3-dimensional compositions, the math can already go over 1,000, right? And in addition to this setup, we have also measured the 60 popular open resolvers and obtained even more concerning results. And we have also done a text simulation experiment. So please check our paper for more details. To wrap up, we have done the first systematic study of DNS application layer DNS amplification. Our findings, the CAM vulnerabilities, allow us to explore the maximum amplification power of resolver. And the most effective way to mitigate CAM is actually to set a limit on the number of queries a resolver sends for each client request, right? But how to set a proper value for this limit still requires a lot of empirical study. And apparently it cannot be too small, right? We disclosed CAM to the 3 vendors involved in our evaluation, and 2 of them have patched their query limiting mechanisms. We have also been collaborating with Swiss National Cybersecurity Center to disclose CAM to international DNS vendors and operators. So hopefully all the affected deployments will be fixed soon. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to take any question. Thank you for your attention.